Dzień dobry wszystkim, witam na kolejnym webinarium organizowanym przez program English Teaching i Instalink. Robimy wspólnie ten projekt od kilku miesięcy. Mam nadzieję, że cieszycie się z tego, że możecie być z nami. Dzisiaj webinarium poprowadzimy w całości w języku angielskim. Za moment przełączymy się na angielski. Ja tylko przypomnę, że w trakcie spotkania możecie wpisać się na listę obecności. Lista obecności jest dostępna pod linkiem, który właśnie się wyświetlił. W trakcie webinarium możecie również korzystać swobodnie z czata, na którym zapraszam do zadawania pytań bezpośrednio do naszej dzisiejszej prowadzącej. Okay, let's switch into English and welcome to our webinar. Today, our special guest is Willow Barnosky from USA. She will conduct a lecture, 1 hour in English about media literacy, identifying online misinformation bias. But before she starts, welcome Daniel Hastings, who is representing US Embassy in Poland, and he will start with a short introduction.
Thank you, Jarosław. Well, dzień dobry państwu. My name is Dan Hastings. I'm the culture attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Warsaw, and it's an honor to welcome all the teachers of English and other languages in Poland to this webinar this evening. Greetings as well to all of our friends of the English program of NIDA, the Nijińska Development Foundation, which is supported by one of our good partners, the Polish American Freedom Foundation. But first, let me thank the NIDA Foundation, namely Justyna Kowalczyk, for organizing this important seminar for English teachers. We greatly appreciate Justyna, and please keep up the great work. We would also like to thank Jarosław Kilon for helping moderate this evening's webinar. Thank you, Jarosław. I would also like to express the Embassy's strong appreciation of our virtual English language fellow, Willow Barnosky, who's connecting with us tonight from California. That's nine time zones away. So thank you so much, Willow, for joining us online from California to help teachers in Poland further develop their skills and spread their professional wings. If I could say one big picture to all of our teachers tonight, it is to convey deep gratitude from Ambassador Georgette Mosbacher, the entire U.S. diplomatic mission in Poland, and the U.S. Department of State for all of the work you do day in and day out, all year long, every year, to help us promote mutual understanding between Poland and the United States. I was an English teacher once, and we all know that languages are keys to new universes of communication with foreign cultures, of learning from foreign literature and scholars, keys for enjoying foreign art, and keys for traveling far from your home to discover new lands, new peoples, and new traditions. So when you teach English, you enable these new universes to come into reach and being for your students, and your impact is lifelong. So please never underestimate your superpowers as English teachers. They are many, they are hugely impactful, and they help create, through mutual understanding, a better future for our world. Media literacy is a hugely important topic right now, and will be as long as digital communications allow citizens, organizations, governments, entire societies, infinite opportunities to publish and upload information and opinions on any and every topic under the sun. Starting early to teach new learners how to read, how to evaluate, and how to interpret information as being objective and factual, or as being information that is biased, unfactual, and even manipulative, is critical to the future of our democratic societies. Our lives depend on the freedom to choose our own and our own country's future paths. And we can only make informed choices if we can objectively assess the universe of information that is now at our fingertips. This can be very hard, as we see around the globe. especially during political elections, during military conflicts, during dialogues on sensitive topics that all of our societies need to have to continue to evolve. So your labors as educators of language are truly essential to the world's future. I cannot say that enough. In fact, your mission could not be more important, and we want and we need you to succeed, and we know you will. Okay, so coming back to Earth, please allow me to mention briefly the following. Please join our conversation clubs run by American Corners all over Poland in Gdansk, Lublin, Łódź, Radom, Katowice, and Kraków Consulate. I also encourage you to visit American Corners to take advantage of a unique online database called eLibrary USA, which is free. It will give you a universe of information about the United States and games and quizzes for your students. So once again, thank you for attending this webinar and taking important lessons away from it. Through December, Willow, again, connecting with us from California, will have additional interesting presentations. So please be sure to follow the Facebook pages of the Embassy in Warsaw and the Consulate General in Kraków for more event details. I wish you a successful and informative webinar and great successful English teaching in your schools. So now over to Willow Barnosky in California.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Jarek, for that introduction.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So we can start now our webinar. Willow, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So welcome everybody to today's webinar on media literacy, identifying online misinformation and bias. And as Jarek and Daniel both said, my name is Willow Barnosky. I'm the Virtual English Language Fellow in Poland this year and last year. This year I'll be teaching at the University of Opole. Last year I was at the University of Rzeszów. And this is an exchange program that I'm participating in through the U.S. Department of State English language programs. And that means that I'm working with the U.S. Consulate in Krakow and the Embassy in Warsaw, and also the Regional English Language Office in Tallinn, Estonia, to give webinars, teacher trainings, presentations, talks to organizations all over Poland. So as Dan mentioned, right now I'm in California. I'm based in San Jose, California. This is a photo of our municipal rose garden that I visited a few weeks ago. So I wanted to ask you, where do you live? Where are you now? And what is your teaching context? Are you teaching primary, secondary, university, adult, all of the above? Please let me know in the comments so I can see who's here today. So where are you teaching now? If you can just type in the comments. Okay. There might be a lag with the comments here. Okay, I see someone's in Krakow Secondary School. Someone's a secondary technical school in Częstochowa. Please excuse my pronunciation. Krakow Secondary School, primary school. Okay. Secondary technical school. Great. Primary in Jesno. In Wrocław, primary, Katowice. Oh, okay, someone's teaching fact checking. Great. Primary school near Wrocław. From Lublin, primary school students in kindergarten. Wonderful, wonderful. Someone's near Łódź. So we have a great variety of people here and educators from kindergarten, primary, secondary. Great. Okay, so wonderful. I'm glad that you're all here today, and I hope that you find this webinar useful. Today we'll be talking about what media literacy is. We'll be talking about how we can incorporate media literacy into our language classes. Someone's from Rzeszów University. We can talk about how language can be used to signal bias And we'll talk about some ideas for raising student awareness of language use and bias. So when I give webinars, I really like it to be interactive, and I really hope that you will be willing to share some of your ideas at the end of the webinar, and that throughout the webinar, you'll be willing to answer some questions for me. So I'll be going through this, giving you some ideas for things you can use in your context, and I would like you to think about how you can take those ideas, if you could use them, if you could adapt them to your context, and I'll be asking you at the end which ideas you think you might like to use, which ideas you've already used, and things that you've used in your own classrooms that you'd like to share, and of course, any questions that you have. So I'm seeing more comments coming in about where people are. Wonderful. Some secondary technical teachers, primary, high school. Wonderful. Great. So first, let's talk about what is media literacy. Okay, so next slide, please. So media literacy is concerned with helping students develop an informed and critical understanding of the nature of mass media and the techniques that are used and the impact of these techniques. This is the definition from the Center for Media Literacy. There are a lot of definitions out there, but basically wanting our students to be informed. I want to ask you another question now. How many of you are teaching classes that are actually dedicated to media literacy? How many of you are teaching media literacy courses right now? And if you're not, you can just say no, or you're not. But I'm curious to see if anyone is actually teaching courses that are totally dedicated to media literacy. Okay, so I got a no from Anetta. No, I don't. Okay. Lots of no's. Yes, and that most teachers that I've talked to, oh, someone's teaching one per course, so maybe one class per course that's devoted to media literacy, okay? But it looks like most of you are not teaching a dedicated media literacy class, and that's really common. Like most of us don't have that luxury of teaching entire classes dedicated to media literacy. So these activities are for things that you can do to incorporate media literacy activities into what we're already teaching. So because most of us don't have that luxury of teaching all of media literacy or teaching media literacy every day. But if we're teaching English, many of us are teaching academic writing, many of us are teaching vocabulary, and we're typically teaching our students how to do research online. So even though we might not call it media literacy, or we might not describe it that way, I'm going to give you some ideas that you can incorporate into your classes already, because we often don't have time for a new curriculum to insert into our classes. And especially now with the pandemic, I've heard that teachers, we're all sort of trying to fit in things in this chaotic time. So I'm going to talk about some things that we can do to add to the classes that we already have, either as extension activities or things that you can do in the first 5 minutes of class or the end of class. And I'm sure many of you are already doing some of these things, but I just wanted to share some ideas that you might not have used yet. And before I go on to talk about academic writing, I just want to say that media literacy is such a broad topic, and there's so much that we could talk about. But we have a short time today, so I'm just going to be focusing on some activities related to the use of language and how language can be used to influence people, how language can signal bias. We want students to become more aware of that language so that they can become more discerning consumers of media, okay? So I'm sorry, going back to the previous slide. When we teach academic writing, one of the things that we're already teaching our students when we teach academic writing is how to use language that is precise and language that is concise. So we want students to not be using too many words in their writing or words that are just filler words. And we want to make sure that they're using words that have an exact meaning. Often we're preparing students maybe for a standardized exam in which they have a maximum amount of words they can use. And if we're teaching students how to write proposals or abstracts, those always have word limits. So we want students to be aware of the words that they're using and to cut back and be more concise. So for example, this is taken from an activity that I did with my students. They were writing an academic essay and they were to use academic language, and they had to respond to several different prompts. And one of them was that the mayor has proposed that the city offer free Polish language classes to international visitors, students, and residents. And these are a few of the lines that I got from my essays. The students were amazing writers. I just picked out a few sentences that were using some of the language that I wanted to signal today. So the first excerpt, a student said, "This would be a really great way for newcomers to get to know local residents." So keep in mind, this is academic writing. Another example, "This proposal is very helpful for visitors and would make their new start in a new country much better. And Polish classes would be tremendously helpful for much better functioning in the city." So when we're talking about writing in a concise way and a precise way and writing within word limits, there are some things that we could say about these sentences. So could anyone comment on what are some examples in these sentences where you see that students aren't being very concise or precise, or they might have a problem with word limits if they're writing this way for a standardized test? So do you see any problems with these sentences in terms of concision or precision? So I'll wait a few seconds because there's definitely a lag with the comments. So what would you tell your students? Okay, so using more formal language and not using very, okay, overuse of very, definitely. The first sentence isn't very precise. Perhaps the use of adverbs such as tremendously, okay. The first sentence has some issues with precision. Very good. So I just wanted to kind of touch on that. Yes, some of you have mentioned it, the use of adverbs, the use of language that's not very formal, using very, etc. So I'm going to talk more about that. And someone mentioned informal language such as really. Okay, next slide, please. So as you mentioned, instead of students saying really great in an academic paper, they could be more precise. What do you mean by it's really great? Maybe they mean it's convenient. Maybe they mean it's effective. Why very helpful? Why not just helpful, especially if you're writing an essay that might have a word limit? Much better versus better. Why tremendously helpful? Why not just helpful? So these are some things that we can point out to students in their writing, and we already do when we're teaching academic writing. But if we talk to the students about the fact that these words can be called intensifiers, that's not a proper grammatical category, but it's a group of adverbs that are used to strengthen the meanings of other words or expressions and show emphasis. So we can define these for students so that they're aware of intensifiers, what intensifiers are, and how they're used. So here are some more examples of intensifiers in use. She was so upset. I felt extremely sorry for her. He has a very strict professor. He was much happier with his previous professor. Their behavior was really offensive. Now, one way you can draw students' attention to these is ask them to read these sentences out loud as is, and ask them to read these sentences as they think they would be said, and then ask them to read the sentences again without those adverbs. And they should notice that when they read them the first time with the intensifiers, there probably is more emotion in their voice. They're putting more emphasis on their words. So here are a few more examples of intensifiers, like amazingly, remarkably, terribly, etc. So you could give a student a list of these words to identify them. And you could talk to students, and this is where the media literacy comes into play, talk to students about the fact that not only are intensifiers good to avoid in academic writing and formal writing, but intensifiers are often used in online content to give additional emotional content to the words that they modify. And for students to think about, why is someone trying to make me more emotional, or why is the writer of this content trying to appeal to my emotions instead of just appealing to my logic or my reason? You could also talk to students about the fact that, of course, intensifiers are they're fine words. You can use them in different contexts. We just don't want to use them in academic writing, and we want to be aware of when they're used. So just raising students' awareness so that they start to notice whenever intensifiers are used. Now, you could give them a few examples or ask students to bring in some examples online in which intensifiers are used in ways that are appropriate. So, for example, the review on the top that I found is from a review of a restaurant, and the title says, "Good food, ridiculously slow service." So that's a use of an intensifier right there. But you could ask students, is this an appropriate use of intensifier? Is this supposed to be academic language? Of course not. So in this case, using an intensifier is fine. This person is trying to appeal to someone's emotion, hoping that someone else does not go to that same restaurant. The second one is from Twitter, and the person responding to someone's argument said, "That is ridiculously simplistic and untrue." And again, for them to notice, why did the person not just say, "That is simplistic and untrue"? They're trying to appeal to emotion. They're trying to put emphasis on what they're saying. It doesn't really add any meaning or content to what they're saying, actually. And again, on Twitter, this is just a tweet from a non-public figure. They're using informal English. This is fine that they're using intensifiers in this context. And then the last three, these are sentences that I lifted from a corpus, and they were being used either as quotes from someone's speech, or someone who had written up what someone was saying. So this is all either speech or reported speech. The first one says, "He has been consistently undazzling in the debates and in his policy rollouts." Second one, "He has shown that he is completely, ridiculously incompetent." The last one, "We are incredibly disappointed at this intentional action." So these are people who are talking, so they are able to use words that are more informal. You can ask students to identify the intensifiers consistently, completely, ridiculously, incredibly, and ask them again, why would a person say consistently undazzling instead of just undazzling? So these are people who are speaking and hoping to appeal to people's emotions and make a stronger point by using these intensifiers that students should be avoiding in their academic writing. Another thing that you can do to raise students' awareness of intensifiers is, you have 5 minutes before or after an activity ends, you can ask students to write an advertisement for an object near them. So at this point, students either have, they've learned a lot about intensifiers, or you've given them the list of intensifiers, and you ask them to write an advertisement. So for example, the students have their phone near them, they can write, this one is amazingly, fast, etc. And so again, drawing students' attention to the fact that advertisements often use intensifiers. And you can have a discussion with students about why that would be. Why would advertisements use intensifiers? And of course, by appealing to our emotions, they're hoping that we will buy their products. So this is something too that you could have students bring in an ad that has a lot of intensifiers to check for their understanding of intensifiers, have each student bring in an ad, other students have to identify the intensifiers in the ad. And then when you're doing your academic writing, if you're doing peer review, you could actually include something like a category for intensifiers on their peer review sheets. So in this way, again, you're incorporating media literacy into academic writing. And for example, on this peer review sheet, I've added a category or a section on intensifiers. So a student would read their peer's paper, see if there are any intensifiers, yes or no. If so, list them here. So again, you're checking for understanding, you're checking to see if students know what intensifiers are and what they are. And this student wrote, really great way, tremendously helpful. And then do the intensifiers make the sentences sound? Check all that apply. So I put, do they make the sentences sound vague? To, remind them that's why we don't want to use them in writing. Do they make the sentences wordy? And or do they make the sentences sound emotional, which is something that we teach. Okay, sorry, someone asked me to slow down a bit. Sorry. So when we teach academic writing, we tell our students that we want them to avoid emotional language, right, in academic writing, because academic writing is meant to be more formal, less emotional, more neutral. And then at the bottom, you could ask students to write a suggested correction below. So, for example, if they have underlined that their peer wrote really great way, they could instead write convenient way. If their peer wrote tremendously helpful, then they could write the suggestion of helpful. So in this way, you are again reviewing and reminding students that these are words that they're going to identify and that they're not words that should be used in reputable sources or in academic writing. Good, Ola, I hope this is a little better. And the next thing we're going to talk about is when you are teaching vocabulary and how you can insert some media literacy activities or media literacy awareness in your students as you are learning, as you're teaching them about vocabulary. So first of all, we're going to talk about extreme adjectives. So extreme adjectives are non-gradable adjectives used for exaggerated descriptions. And of course, when we teach about vocabulary, we teach about adjectives. We can teach students about gradable adjectives, non-gradable adjectives. But in this example, we're going to draw their attention to how these can be used in media. So a few more examples. When you're talking about extreme adjectives, you're often talking about the exaggerated adjective form, right? So for example, big is a base adjective. It's more neutral. Huge is exaggerated. Small is the base adjective. Tiny is extreme. Intelligent as the base, and brilliant is extreme. So I'm going to give you a minute to comment. If you could give your students this list of extreme adjectives and this list of base adjectives and ask your students to come up with the extreme adjectives. 1 or 2 for each word. So for example, give your students the word cold and they might come up with the word freezing. So this is raising your students' awareness of the different exaggerated forms that adjectives can describe. So in this list, you have dirty, clean, angry, tired, crowded, old, and scary. So if you can take a minute in the comments and share, like I'm, modeling what you would be doing in your classroom, share what an extreme adjective or what an exaggerated form could be for each of these adjectives. Great, so dirty, an extreme adjective could be filthy. Angry, an extreme adjective could be furious. Tired, exhausted. Old, ancient. Angry, furious, dirty, filthy. Scary, terrifying. And I think you might have, what about clean? I think you've answered everyone now except clean, maybe. Clean, pure. Depending on the context. Great. Okay, so now I'm going to share some of the example answers. So I think you've covered most of them. Dirty, filthy. Clean could be spotless, could be immaculate. Angry, furious. Oh, clean, impeccable, someone just said. Angry for furious. Tired for exhausted. crowded for packed, old for ancient, and scary for terrifying. And then someone just made a comment about using a reducer with some of these words, like rather or quite. Okay, so you could say, instead of dirty, you could say rather filthy. Yes, absolutely. That's another form of exaggerating the meaning of an adjective, for sure. Great example. Okay. So as we're teaching students about adjectives and different types of adjectives, we can remind them that these adjectives can be used to appeal to their emotions. They can be used to convince or to persuade, and they can be a signal of bias, so that when our students are reading things online or seeing things in media using these extreme adjectives, it doesn't mean that they're being manipulated necessarily, but we do want our students to suddenly become cautious or suddenly just become aware of what they're reading and notice, hey, we learned about these words in class. I know these are extreme adjectives. There are a lot of extreme adjectives in this article. Why is that? So we just want to raise their awareness about these words. Next kind of language that we can talk about is loaded language. And does anybody know why I have this photo on the slide? Or does anybody know what is in the photo? Yeah, somebody said nachos, and no, but it looks delicious. Yeah, so these could be called loaded nachos, although I personally would prefer a ton of cheese. I can't even see the cheese on these, but loaded nachos or nachos with a lot of ingredients on them. So this is something I really missed. One of the first meals I had when I returned to California. So loaded language is language that can have really strong positive or negative connotations. And yeah, like not loaded nachos would be like exaggerated nachos. So loaded language would be when there could be a neutral word or a base word that could be used, but instead a word with some sort of emotional meaning is used instead. So there is often a deliberate reason why someone would choose one of those words instead of using the base form or the neutral form. And I'll talk about a few examples. And this is wording that can attempt to influence the audience, and you can be appealing to emotion or appealing to stereotypes also. So here are a few examples that you could give to your students. Yes, I would be quite stuffed after eating it. Sorry, some of you are posting really funny comments. For loaded language, you could give students some sets of words and ask them to compare the two words. These are words that are synonymous, but there are different shades of meaning. So let's take a minute and just look at these pairs of words. And how would you describe these two words? How would you compare them? Is one neutral and one is negative, or one is positive and one is negative? How would you explain the difference between these two words in these pairs? Because our students might not know. They might just view these all as synonyms. Yes, so for example, group is a neutral term and mob has a negative connotation. Exactly. Well, it is true. The context is important, but I think even without context, these words have certain shades of meaning that we want students to identify. So inexpensive could be positive, or inexpensive could be neutral as opposed to cheap, which has more of a negative connotation. Interesting. So historic could be neutral, memorable is more positive. Yeah, I think memorable is a positive term. I think, too, there can be different meanings for those. So, for example, if something is called historic, there's often this connotation that it's something that maybe involves an entire nation or the entire world. It's the kind of event that would go into a history book. Whereas something's memorable, it's something that's smaller, something that might be memorable for a person, a family, or a small group of people. So it's not necessarily that there's a negative or positive connotation, but the historic has a more grand meaning, right? Eliminate is quite extreme compared to remove. Yes, for sure. But I have seen students use that as a synonym as for remove in their papers. So yes, eliminate is much stronger. Eliminate sounds like, you know, destroying something, possibly killing someone, right? So very different meaning from remove, very different shades of meaning. Challenging is positive while distressing is negative. Yes, challenging could be seen as positive or as neutral, whereas distressing is very emotional and quite negative, right? Cheap could be seen as negative or offensive. Yes, I think typically cheap is used to talk about something that might have a lower quality, whereas inexpensive is just talking about the fact that it's not expensive, right? Vigilante is negative, crime fighter is more heroic. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. If someone is described as a vigilante, it's seen as a negative. As someone's actions as seen as being a crime fighter, that's a much more positive spin for sure. And someone said that inexpensive can be neutral. Great. So let's move on to the next slide. Another thing that you could do is give students some example sentences using these pairs of words. So we talked a little bit about group versus mob and crime fighter versus vigilante. You could give these to students in context, either, you know, examples from a corpus, so they're seeing authentic examples of language and use, or ask students to look them up. So, for example, a group of concerned citizens supported the mayor. An angry mob protested climate change. So you could look at this as one of the vocabulary activities that we already do with our students, teaching them about meaning, teaching them about synonyms and antonyms, teaching them about the, you know, the nuances that words can have. But also you can use this to teach students about the intention behind the writer's words. So you could ask students to look at 1A and 1B and say, you know, what were the writer's intentions in writing that? Or what do you think the writer's perspective is? So in 1A, you could ask students, the writer that said a group of concerned citizens supported the mayor. Do you think that the writer agrees with the citizens or disagrees with the citizens? Or do you think that the writer approves of the citizens or does not approve of the citizens? Or can we not tell? So we can get students talking about how language can be neutral. It can be, you know, language that we don't know the writer's intentions or the writer's perspectives, or language that can be used to persuade or to signal bias. So, you know, for the first one, a group of concerned citizens supported the mayor. The word concerned makes it sound like maybe the writer supports the citizens, but it's a fairly neutral statement. But in the second one, an angry mob protested climate change. If you ask students, what does the writer think about this group of people? This angry mob. Why did the writer use these words, angry mob or just mob, instead of group of people, instead of group of citizens? So we want students to start thinking about what that person wants them to believe or wants them to think about this group of people. You might even ask students, what do you think the writer thinks about climate change? Do you think the writer is trying to signal to us that people who protest climate change, they're angry, they're a mob? In a way, they might be trying to influence us to think that climate change is not important, for example. And then for the second pairs, Paul Anderson, a local crime fighter, acted in self-defense. So in this sentence, Paul Anderson, according to this writer, has been doing this, did this thing that's quite noble or heroic. They're a crime fighter. And also the fact that they're local. So it makes them sound like someone that we feel closer to, maybe one of our neighbors. And they acted in self-defense. So you could ask students even to rewrite this sentence in a different way, because this, you know, it sounds like it's saying that this Paul Anderson actually harmed someone else, right? And then the last example, vigilante John Sensnig attacked a local man. Someone mentioned that vigilante could be negative or could be ambiguous or could be neutral sometimes. I think typically it's used to be negative. Vigilante usually means a person who is a criminal. They're breaking the law. They're taking the law into their own hands. And in this sentence, vigilante John Sensnig attacked a local man. That's an even stronger negative. And you can ask students to choose the words that kind of give emotional context. Besides vigilante typically being negative, this person attacked. He didn't act in self-defense, right? He attacked someone, and he didn't just attack anyone, he attacked a local man. So really teaching students to pull these sentences apart and look at these words to decide what sort of message this writer is sending. Another thing that you could do is when you're teaching, vocabulary and synonyms, and I'm sure you do this, but having students go to an online thesaurus like thesaurus.com, type in an adjective like big, and see all of the different terms that can be considered, depending on the context, to be synonymous. They can be extreme adjectives. They can be more complete synonyms or more perfect synonyms like large or great, the two that are at the top. Or they could be really emotional words. Now, again, I'm sure we've all had students who have just sort of plucked words out of a thesaurus and thought that they had the exact same meaning. Of course, some of it depends, or all of it depends on context, but some of these words, when we look at them, we know immediately as fluent English speakers that these words are not formal, or these words are too emotional or exaggerated or extreme, right? So we could give students a page like this with big and with all the synonyms and ask them or with a partner to categorize these words. Which of these words sound emotional? Which sound more neutral? Which words sound formal? Which words sound informal? So again, just developing this sense in our students for the nuance of language. You could pair this, or you could do a separate activity in which you have students take a word from that thesaurus page and plug it into a corpus. I took this from Coca. And you can have them see the examples of this word used in authentic context, and also where is this word used. So for example, I chose the word humongous from the last page. So humongous was listed as like a synonym of big. So some students might think humongous means the same as big. So if they plug this into a corpus, they can see on the left, these words, these sentences in which humongous is used, none of them are from an academic source. So we see magazines, spoken sources, fiction. There are a couple of news, but it looks like they're quotations, someone's quoted speech. So to show them that humongous, if you're seeing that it's used here and it's not used in an academic context, isn't a word that we'd want to use because it's not a formal vocabulary term. And if it is being used in something online that claims to be an academic source or claims to be using formal English, we have to question why that is. Another thing that we teach our students, and we do this all the time, and we don't necessarily think of it as media literacy, is we teach students how to do online research. Or sometimes we don't even have a chance to teach them how to do it. We just tell them that they have to do online research. And we may already tell students some things that are like media literacy. For example, we might tell our students certain sites that they can use. You might suggest a few sites for students to go to find their research, or you might tell them certain sites to avoid. Like you might say, I don't want to see any Wikipedia articles listed in the biblio for this academic paper, for example. So one way that we can help students when they're doing online research is by helping them to recognize when political language is used, because it's often a signal of bias. Now, for the purpose of this webinar, I'm kind of simplistically talking about liberals and conservatives. I know that politics is not really a binary, there's a whole spectrum, but just for simplicity's sake, I'm going to talk about these two sides. So I have a question for you. So we as adults, and we as fluent or native speakers of the language, we really have an idea for the nuances of certain words. But our students often might not have that knowledge, or they might be so surrounded by a certain kind of talk that they don't realize that language might be biased, or that language might convey or display a certain way of thinking. And of course, depending on the class that you teach, the age that you teach, this isn't about telling students what they should or shouldn't believe. This is more just about raising students' awareness to the fact that everyone has biases, and that you want the students to be aware at least of the source that they're looking at, what the bias of that source might be. So I wanted to ask you, what are some words or phrases that when you hear someone say them or you see that someone's written them, you immediately think, I know that person's political affiliation, or I bet I can guess if that person is a liberal or a conservative. So what are some words or expressions that you hear? And you can give some words in English or in Polish, but please give me a translation, that as soon as you hear someone use that word, you think, oh, I think that person's a liberal, or oh, I think that person's probably conservative. What are some of those words or phrases? Okay, if someone talks about making something great again or making America great again, then you would assume that they have a certain political stance, okay? What else? In my times. Well, if someone says in my times, maybe you'd assume maybe they're older, and that might make you assume that you know what their political stance is, okay? Using the word illegal, depending on the context, you could immediately determine or decide if, sure, it depends on the context. Mm-hmm. If someone's talking a lot about tradition or the importance of tradition, you could assume that they're probably conservative. Mm-hmm. Yeah, if someone says politically correct, I think it too would depend. Are they using it sardonically? Are they using it literally? Right. So politically correct, that could be subjective itself. Someone talking about immigrants versus fugitives, absolutely. So Polish expression for total opposition. Okay, so someone uses a specific phrase used by a certain political party. Mm-hmm. Okay, so which verbs are used when you're talking about a politician, right? Very good. That too would go back to talking about like mob versus crowd, which words are used to describe a politician and what they've said or what they've done. Mm-hmm. What else? Using the word patriot or patriotic. Yeah, for sure. Again, depending on the context, but typically if someone says, I am a patriot, you might assume certain things about that person. The word woke used as a weapon. Okay, so if someone is kind of making fun of someone by using the word woke, you can assume maybe what their political affiliation is, for sure. If someone's using religious language and phrases, you might assume that they're more conservative. Sure, for sure. Okay, great. So I'm going to share some examples. So I've talked to a lot of teachers too who said, you know, we don't talk about politics in class, or I have to be really careful because my students' parents, if you're teaching younger students, their parents might get upset. And I think it's really true. We're not, depending on the kind of teacher you are and your own personal stance, you might, you know, want to make sure in class that you're just being completely neutral. Some teachers and educators have no problem sharing their own political views and just saying, this is my bias, I just want you to be aware of it. But one thing I think that you can do is, especially as English teachers, is if you don't feel comfortable talking about things in your own country, then you can use the example of another country. Like it's quite easy to pull examples from the United States if you're talking about politics, so that students don't feel that their own families' beliefs or maybe their own community's beliefs are being attacked, even if they're not, because you know, then at that point, students might kind of shut down and not listen to what we're teaching them because they feel that they're being attacked. So it all depends on your context, your students' ages, and what subject you're teaching. And not that we should never ask students to question what they believe or what they know. That's why I think that it's so important just to teach students to notice when there's bias, because they might not have known that certain words that they've always heard being used signaled a bias. I have met people who have said certain words really cautiously. They thought the word was like a slur, and it wasn't a slur. It was just a word that they'd only ever heard used as a slur, so they thought it was bad language. So this is just kind of a way of making students more aware. Some examples from the States, not just the States, but it's just the context I'm most familiar with. If someone is talking about a government worker and they say someone's a bureaucrat, I immediately assume the person's more conservative, because typically conservatives think that government is too big, it's this huge bureaucracy, and someone working for the government is just a bureaucrat. And then someone who uses the expression public servant to refer to a government worker, I would assume is more liberal, because liberals tend to have a more positive view of government workers, or like the big government idea. If someone mentioned before in the comments the word illegal, depending on the context, it can really signal something. For me, if I hear someone refer to people as illegals, I 100% assume that I know what their political leanings are, versus if someone says undocumented immigrants, I also would make an assumption. If someone's talking, again, based on the context, if someone is talking about liberal media in the form of a complaint, like they're complaining about the liberal media, I would assume they're conservative, because conservatives typically believe that the media is too liberal. If someone uses the phrase people experiencing homelessness, I also would assume that they're more liberal, or I would make an assumption about their beliefs, because instead of referring to people as homeless, like it's a permanent trait or it's a characteristic, this person is making the point that homelessness can be a temporary experience. Maybe they're raising the point to make us think that maybe any of us could actually experience homelessness at a certain point. So these are just a few words and expressions that I think typically show a certain political stance or bias, but our students might be completely unaware of that. So just by having them look at these words, we can be raising their awareness. And there are a few ways that we can do this in class, and we can add some information or some sources when students are doing online research. I don't know how well you can see this, but this is an infographic from the website Information is Beautiful, and they do visualizations of different concepts. Now, this is a world visualization of different like liberal and conservative beliefs. It's very general, and it's based on some different countries. And if you see on the left, it's talking about people who identify with the left and what their views would be. So for example, under society and culture, it says something like people on the left typically think like the world needs to be improved upon, or the world can become better, or the world can evolve. And they value inclusivity, multiculturalism, this idea of society evolving. Whereas if you go over to the right, it talks about people who identify with the right. Their view of society and culture might be something more like the world is fine as it is, and they might believe more in exclusivity, nationalism, and conservative values. So this is just a generalization of what the two sides often believe in. But again, if your students are raised in a certain culture and they've only ever heard one perspective, they might not have known that these were political stances, and they might not know what the differences are. So this site is informationisbeautiful.net. They have tons of really cool infographics. So this is something you could direct your students to, or you could print it out for them. And one thing you could do is give your students some topics and tell them to look at this infographic and say, what do you think the left would say about this topic? And what do you think the right would say about it? So you could just give them a list, like for example, immigration, and just tell them, well, what would the left say about this, do you think, judging from this infographic? And what do you think the right would say? So again, you can do it in very neutral terms, or you can, if you're talking about another country, you can talk about the United States, so that students don't feel that they're being asked to criticize maybe their own family's values, and they can be looking at it from a distance, make it a little easier. Another graphic that I found is from allsides.com. And All Sides tagline is unbiased news doesn't exist. We show all sides. Okay. So on this chart, they have listed a bunch of media sources and a bunch of websites that could be considered considered identifying with the left, left-leaning, center, right-leaning, or on the right. And so this is something that we as adults often just kind of take for granted, that we know when we hear a certain website or we hear about a certain source, we think, oh, I know what side that source is on, but our students might not know this. So you could give students this when they're doing research, add some more local sites, and tell them, look, I'm just giving you this information so that you know when you're looking at different resources that there can be a bias on that site. And this chart doesn't say if the information is correct, like if they're not claiming that something is accurate or not, they're just talking about the perspective of that publication. And I see we only have a few minutes left, so great, perfect timing. So I wanted to ask you if you could share some ideas for things that you've done with your students to raise awareness about media literacy, or any activities that you've used, or anything that I shared today that you think you could use or you have used. And also, let me know if you have any questions. And I'll wait, hopefully we have a few minutes for that, and then I have a few more resources to share with you. Actually, while I wait for your comments to come up, I'm going to finish showing you the slides, and you can just type your comments and your ideas. So the University of Michigan has a free online course through Coursera on disinformation, misinformation, and fake news teach out. And this started earlier, but I just got an email that they've extended the course. So you can sign up for that, take it for free, and learn about that. And also the University of Hong Kong and the State University of New York have a free online course called Making Sense of the News, News Literacy Lessons for Digital Citizens that you can also take for free to learn more about how you can teach that in your class. And here's a list of more resources. I won't have time to go over them now, but if you'd like me to send you the PDF, I'll give you my email at the end. Next slide, please. And if you're looking for more resources, more free resources for teaching, you can go to americanenglish.state.gov. They also have lessons and plans and activities on digital literacy and media literacy. If you're interested in exchange programs, educationusa.pl has exchange programs for students to study in the States. And the program that I'm with, the English Language Fellow Program at exchanges.state.gov, has a list of programs for both non-US citizens and US citizens to do around the world. And if you'd like to follow the Regional English Language Office or the US Embassy in Poland, they have Facebook pages and Instagram and Twitter. And my email is wbarnosky2015@gmail.com if you'd like to get the PDF for this presentation. I'm also on Instagram at elfinpoland, and I sometimes post English resources or put some things in my stories about free courses, etc. online. So let me just see a few comments. Okay, great. So you like the graphics and the infographics. Students do love infographics. I was so happy to stumble onto that site, and they have infographics about a variety of topics. Anything else? I don't see any other comments. So thank you so much for attending the webinar today. I hope you found some useful things that you can use in your classes that you can kind of add to your lessons or use as extension activities.
Thank you very much, Willow. Dziękujemy wszystkim za uwagę i zapraszamy na kolejne webinaria programu Teaching i InstaLink.